Mesdames et messieurs, bonjour. Mon nom est Martine Lagacé. Je suis professeure et vice-rectrice associée à la promotion et au développement de la recherche à l'Université d'Ottawa. Bienvenue à cette toute première conférence sur le fédéralisme fiscal canadien. D'abord et avant tout, nous souhaitons rendre hommage au peuple algonquin, gardien traditionnel de cette terre. Nous reconnaissons le lien sacré de longue date l'unissant ce territoire qui demeure non cédé. Nous rendons également hommage à tous les peuples autochtones qui habitent Ottawa, qu'ils soient de la région ou d'ailleurs au Canada. Nous reconnaissons les gardiens des savoirs traditionnels, jeunes et âgés. Nous honorons aussi leurs courageux dirigeants d'hier, d'aujourd'hui et de demain. I would now like to greet our three distinguished scholars and experts who will be our guest panelists for today's opening session. Louis Lévesque, Canada's former Deputy Minister of International Trade and of Transport Canada, and a lecturer at McGill University, Max Bell School of Public Policy. Richard Burr, Professor Emeritus at the University of Toronto and a Senior Fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs. Jim Dinning, Chancellor Emeritus of the University of Calgary and former legislator and treasurer of the province of Alberta. Our moderator, Madeleine Drohan, an award-winning writer and a former Canada correspondent for The Economist, and a senior fellow at the University of Ottawa's Graduate School for Public and International Affairs. Greetings to all our distinguished guests, to fellow researchers, professors, to students, and to all participants. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you who are remotely participating to this first edition of the Conference on Fiscal Federalism across Canada. This three-day event is organized by the Centre on Governance at the University of Ottawa in collaboration with McGill Institute for the Study of Canada and the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. L'événement bénéficie du généreux soutien du Secrétariat du Québec aux relations canadiennes et de celui du Forum des fédérations. Cette conférence s'inscrit aussi dans la foulée des projets de recherche qui sont financés par le Forum pour le dialogue Alex Trebek de l'Université d'Ottawa, une vaste initiative qui vise à soutenir le déploiement de notre expertise et de notre influence en matière de politique publique. Fiscal federalism, as you all well know, is a major component of our economy, which has a resounding impact on the lives of all Canadians. Timely following the recent unveiling of the 2021 federal budget, this major event will precisely highlight the importance, the interconnectedness, and the challenges of our multi-level fiscal governance, and will tackle a wide range of issues related to fiscal federalism. The 6 panels convening during the next 2 days will comprehensively assess and discuss the various components and processes of the transfers from Ottawa to the provinces. Les discussions jetteront notamment un éclairage sur différents enjeux, comme le financement de l'éducation élémentaire et secondaire au Canada, le vieillissement de la population, les enjeux d'équité et d'autonomie seront également soulevés. Avant de conclure, permettez-moi de remercier très chaleureusement le professeur Éric Champagne, directeur du Centre d'études en gouvernance, qui a joué un rôle majeur, un rôle catalyseur même dans la mise en place de cette conférence. Une conférence qui incarne d'ailleurs parfaitement le mandat du Centre d'études en gouvernance de l'Université d'Ottawa, un centre qui travaille en synergie avec des organisations partenaires pour mieux comprendre les mécanismes de gouvernance et qui déploie activement la palette de la mobilisation des connaissances afin d'améliorer le fonctionnement des organisations ainsi que la conception et la mise en œuvre des politiques publiques. As we are all eager to listen to our distinguished keynote speakers, I will now turn things back over to you, Madeleine, and wish you all a very, very successful event. Merci d'être là. Excellente conférence à vous.
Merci beaucoup, Martine. And hello, everyone. Welcome to this opening panel. It's sort of subtitled The Practitioners the people that we're going to be hearing from, the three that we're going to be hearing from, are the ones that have worked not just on the theory of fiscal federalism, but have actually had to do it in practice. Now, just a couple of housekeeping things first. Each of the three will speak for 10 minutes, and after everyone has spoken, then we'll get into the Q&A session. Now, you can post a question at any time while people are speaking. You'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's a little Q&A. And so just put your question in there and I will try to keep track of them as they're coming up, and we'll start putting them to the panelists at the end of the session. Ça, c'est une conférence bilingue, alors vous pouvez poser des questions en anglais ou en français. And there's also a translation available. Again, if you look at the bottom of your screen, there's a little globe there. On my screen, it says interpretation. If you click on that, then you can choose what language you want to hear, English, French, or I think the floor. Yeah, I think that's it for housekeeping. So we're going to get right into it. And our panelists have already been introduced, which has saved me some time, saved us some time. So I will start first with Louis Lévesque. Over to you, Mr. Lévesque.
Merci, Madeleine. Bonjour tout le monde. Pour ceux qui ne me connaissent pas, j'ai été très impliqué dans la mise en place du régime actuel d'arrangements fiscaux, notamment l'entente sur la santé en 2004, les négociations avec Terre-Neuve et Labrador et la Nouvelle-Écosse sur l'extra-côtier et la mise en place du rapport O'Brien en 2007. Donc, ça me donne une perspective assez particulière. Et le principe, dans le fond, ou l'approche que je vais prendre aujourd'hui, c'est qu'on ne peut pas comprendre où on va si on ne sait pas d'où on vient. Et dans ce contexte-là, c'est pour ça que je me suis amusé à faire certains tableaux. Je suis un économiste, on ne me corrigera pas. Et vous allez voir, mes messages sont relativement simples, mais je vais maintenant passer, je vais mettre des graphiques en PowerPoint, puis les présenter en anglais. Je vais revenir au français par la suite, et comme il a été dit, je vais prendre les questions dans les deux langues dans la période de questions. Donc là, je fais le partage d'écran. Et je vais mettre ça en mode plein écran. OK. Voilà. Le message que je veux donner, premier message, matter of fact, the first message, is that there's been very divergent path between provincial and federal debt levels after 2007. If you look at the chart, what you see is basically the fact that after the fiscal adjustments of the 1990s, the federal debt came down massively. Provincial debt also came down, but not to the same extent. But fundamentally, since the financial crisis, combined with the oil price decline that happened after that, provincial debt has been on an upward trend. And in fact, with a historically high level before the pandemic, and that totally contrary to the debt at the federal level. There'll be a lot of discussion whether or not the federal government should have been going back to budget balance, but the federal government stayed as a situation where before the pandemic, the debt was basically hovering around a little bit over 30% of GDP. In the case of provinces, it's been going up. Next question is, obviously, why? Well, the first one portion of the answer is obviously what has happened to energy producing provinces. Oil prices have declined significantly in the mid 2010. And as a result of that, has been significant impact on mostly on Newfoundland at the one end of the country and Alberta at the other end. It's in terms of numbers, the impacts on these provinces are big, but collectively, this is not the source of the debt increase. And in fact, I've done the analysis and you see some data there about the debt in relative terms between provinces. In fact, the spread has been coming down So the issue is not an horizontal one. It's really the debt, the growth in debt is really a vertical one. And I will surprise you by talking about health. The harsh reality is that provincial health spending has been growing faster than the revenues of provinces for the last basically 15 years. And cumulatively, like, what does that mean is that by 2019, there was about $32 billion of spending on health that was not financed by the growth in revenue since 2007. And this number is only going up. What does that mean? It's not funded through lower spending on other programs or debt. It means it has to be funded to either lower spending on other programs or debt. And guess what? It's been largely funded through debt. So this is basically the debt that's been accumulated from provincial deficits since 2007. A little bit over $175 billion by the end of 2019. No magic. Health costs have grown faster than provincial revenues, and the rest of spending has not been adjusted down in proportion, which means a lot of it has gone into debt. Another important culprit is the increase in infrastructure spending that's been going on in the last 15, 20 years. After years of neglect, there's been a renewed kind of focus on infrastructure, but the way it's accounted for, the way province budgeted, and provinces basically are responsible for 90% of the infrastructure, and in fact finance most of the provincial infrastructure, the municipal infrastructure. That has resulted basically in a net increase in about $200 billion in provincial debt. This is all before the pandemic. What the pandemic is likely to do is exacerbate those trends. There's no reason that the health spending growth associated with aging will slow down. There's no reason, in fact, there's all the reason in the world to see that there's going to be more pressure on infrastructure spending. Oil prices have recovered a little bit. They've dropped during the beginning of the pandemic, but they recovered in terms, so that impact will be smaller. But there will be significant costs added to the cost base of provinces because of the pandemic, notably because of things such as ongoing testing, vaccine, immunization, and things like that. And the other thing is that, and I stop basically in terms now the screen sharing. Don't need that anymore. Okay. Voila. And what's going to happen after that is that these costs are going to continue. And the current situation, and they're not only continuing at level, they are growing, which means there's an increased pressure in terms of provincial finances that's likely to come, which puts into question the whole sustainability of provincial finances. And you've seen a lot of studies about that. And in terms, they look mostly at the future. My point was, let's look at whether this is happening. And in fact, this has been happening in terms of the last 15 years. I'll finish up, I'll see I'm at 8 minutes or 7 and 8 minutes with a couple of points about the federal budget. And I'll take a look at the federal budget from the perspective of...
Je vais me pencher sur le budget fédéral du point de vue...
Du fédéralisme... je vais dire quelques mots du point de vue du budget fédéral sur le fédéralisme fiscal, excusez-moi. Ce qui est absolument fascinant d'observer, c'est encore une fois, on s'aperçoit que la dette fédérale va probablement être sous contrôle, à moins de chocs majeurs dans les 5, 6, 7 prochaines années, va reprendre une tendance à la baisse. Mais en même temps, il n'y a pas de reconnaissance au niveau fédéral de la dynamique que j'ai décrite qui s'est passée au niveau des finances publiques provinciales dans les 15 dernières années. C'est dans ce contexte-là, pour moi, notamment, je regarde la proposition pour un programme de garderie à frais partagés. Le programme à frais partagés, sauf peut-être pour le Québec, ça va vouloir dire d'autres pressions de l'ordre de 8 à 10 milliards et en augmentation, des pressions permanentes sur les dépenses de programme des provinces. Et je pense qu'il est rendu un moment où il va falloir une réflexion vraiment importante sur la soutenabilité de la situation financière des provinces. Je vous remercie.
Thanks very much, Mr. Lévesque. That's a nice scary picture that you've painted for us to start off with. So yes, and there's already questions coming in, but we'll wait until the end of everyone that has spoken. But please, I encourage everyone to keep posting your questions and we will get to them. Now I'm going to turn it over to Richard Bird.
Okay, thank you very much. That was a a somewhat depressing beginning. I'm going to stand way back. I'm, unlike the other members of this panel, I'm really not a practitioner. I'm an academic who has spent a lot of his life dabbling in this kind of question around the world, but not really in Canada, partly because while I am bilingual, my second language is Spanish, not French. Anyway, I really only going to make 3 points here. I'm trying to put the whole thing a little bit more in context. I think the first point is simply that a useful way to look at fiscal federalism, at least to me, is to think of it as an essential component of the underlying social contract in this country. And a second point is going to be that I think from this perspective, the pandemic has illustrated some quite problematic features of Canadian federalism. And Mr. Lévesque has just pointed another one out. And the third is that I think also, on the other hand, that this experience also tells us some ways we should be strengthening that contract so we can deal with the upcoming problems, and they will be upcoming in the future. Now, the first notion that a implicit social contract underpins a sustainable nation has been discussed in different ways by many different authors over the centuries. The idea is simply that to establish and sustain a government in any setting, citizens in effect have to implicitly, they seldom explicitly, implicitly agree to do so. And in a democratic setting, you assume that they do so mainly for the benefits they perceive from doing so. But since to provide any benefits, governments have to both tax and spend, any social contract necessarily has an important fiscal dimension, a kind of social fiscal contract, if you will. And the sustainability of that contract depends essentially on citizen trust that most government spending will be on the whole useful for the people. And secondly, that the taxes they require to pay for it will be fair as people understand fairness. That's a sort of a basic problem. Now, a federal country like Canada faces a more difficult task in cultivating and maintaining this level of support for a number of reasons. In the first place, governments have to deal not only with perceptions of interpersonal fairness, but also interjurisdictional fairness. And because these two concepts are to some extent contradictory, poor people live in rich areas, rich people in poor areas, and whether they're poor or rich, people can and do move. But when, how, and where they move is in part itself dependent on policy decisions that are intended to achieve one or the other fairnesses. The trouble is, in doing so, they can reduce our perception of fairness in the other dimension. The whole natural resources thing shows this quite clearly, I think. As part of the original contract, federal constitutions usually limit the extent to which governments can make changes. That's what a federal constitution does. But changing circumstances may require changes in institutions to maintain a coherent stability within whatever framework we have. So fiscal federalism, an inherent characteristic of fiscal federalism is that it is always under negotiation and may sometimes undergo major changes. In Canada, for example, I think this contract, the fiscal federalism contract, if you will, has moved from one equilibrium position to another over time. Just to start way back at the beginning, we really set the fiscal system up to be largely federally dominated, in deliberate contrast to the US, which had just finished the Civil War. And so from Confederation till after the First World War, the system remained largely federally dominated, and provinces really didn't matter that much. Whatever else was being done was done mainly by municipal rather than provincial governments. Then the depression of the 1930s, followed by the Second World War, and then the upsurge of the growth of the social state, as it's called, led to an enormous increase in both federal and provincial government activity. The provinces over time became not only big spenders, but also big taxers. And when they did this, the disparities between their capacities to meet the new demands were quite accentuated across the country. To restore equilibrium, maintain the contract, if you will, federal transfers were substantially increased because the federal government wasn't going to let go of the taxes. And these transfers included, for the first time, a really explicit equalization transfer. But as Monsieur Lévesque has already pointed out, continued increases in provincial spending, the growing increase of natural resource revenues in some provinces, and the continuing pressure on the federal budget from global developments further stressed the federal fiscal contract. Once again, the result back in the mid-90s and early 2000s was again largely to change the structure of federal transfers when it comes to the fiscal federalism. But of course, as Mr. Lévesque also said, the pressures continued to mount owing to both domestic and global factors, most recently the pandemic. Now, he gave you a rather bleak outlook of the future, and I'll come back to that at the end, I think. But the question I want to raise now is whether the current governmental structure can cope with these pressures, and not to mention the inevitably unknown future shocks that lie ahead, some of which are fairly foreseeable. First, what does the pandemic suggest about the social fiscal contract in our fiscal federal system? Most people, and most experts actually, seem to think, as one columnist recently put it, our governments keep botching COVID-19. This isn't just a personal perception. There are quite extensive studies by the OECD and others showing that Canada's response, compared to that in many other countries, developed and not so developed, has indeed been rather poorly organized, poorly implemented, and perhaps undesirably fragmented. One response to this that seems quite common with many people is that what we need is a clear, uniform national policy. This is not a surprising reaction, but it's probably also not right. Even if the desired outcomes are identical everywhere, the different needs, capacities, and challenges in different localities, regions, and provinces do require different asymmetric responses. Indeed, this is precisely why decentralized governance makes sense in a country like ours. But a major obstacle we've all faced in responding adequately to the pandemic has been that no one is able to fully understand what's going on, and certainly no one can predict what will happen next week or next month with much confidence. I think the scientific community has done an incredible job at analyzing this new virus and responding to it far more quickly than ever before. But like the virus itself, our knowledge of how best to deal with it changes and mutates as we acquire more information about how different and how well different responses may work with different populations in different circumstances. Science is not carved in stone. It's not a revealed truth. As I think it was Karl Popper once said, it can be better seen to be the social result of mutual criticism. What we know inevitably and properly changes as we learn more, and it's unlikely ever to be complete or completely definitive. Now, developing and implementing an effective public policy is also always a complex and a difficult endeavor. We almost never understand sufficiently well how all the moving parts of the complex social, political, and economic system in which we live will interact in changing circumstances. So I think it's no surprise that almost any policy we adopt always has some unintended and unwanted consequences. A crisis like the pandemic demands a rapid and sweeping response, but the problem is the more quickly we act, the more likely we are to get it wrong to some extent, especially when, as now, neither the future course of the crisis or the effectiveness of different actions is entirely clear. People do not like uncertainty. When they don't understand why they should do something or exactly what it is they're supposed to do, they get angry. Good governments need to listen to what people ask, respond promptly and intelligibly to their questions, and adjust their own behavior to deal with the problems people perceive, or else persuade them those fears are not real. This is easy to say stuff like this, but it's very hard to do. But no one knows with any certainty how the virus will adapt, how effective different countermeasures may be, or when and to what extent vaccinations of different groups will reduce the damage. it's very unlikely that we could turn everything over to a central decision maker and get the right outcome. But a major lesson that the pandemic has underlined yet again in Canada is that an effective decentralized response requires two things we're not very good at. One is coordination between different levels of government, vertical and horizontal, and the other is much better communication by governments at all levels. Now, why have we not done so well with those things, at least in my opinion? Well, one reason is simply the Constitution, nature of federal state. Our Constitution, I haven't worked much in Canada, actually, but I've worked a great deal in many other federal countries. Our Constitution is unusual in the extent to which it attempts to separate the functions of federal and provincial governments. In reality, as we vividly have seen recently, these functions inevitably overlap with regard to things like health. Astonishingly little attention has been paid in Canada to how best to develop a sound, basic intergovernmental coordination mechanism to function effectively in a crisis. In particular, like when as now local governments have to do most of whatever's done, they have no formal seat at the policy table. They have relatively few resources of their own. They face extremely varied situations. So they are usually as unlikely as the public to fully understand what's going on or how to be able to plan to deal with whatever will happen next week or next month. So that's a kind of a structural problem. In addition, in a parliamentary system, the only role of the opposition is to criticize. So it's not a surprise that's what they do. But in Canada, the most effective opposition is often at the other level of government. So all too often we end up in a useless game like the recent federal and provincial blame shifting. Another result of the same feature is that because, and anybody who's ever written one of these statements, and I have done that, knows this, official statements tend to be structured to provide as little ammunition for the opposition as possible. But one result is they often fail to explain precisely what is being done or not done or why, and add to public confusion and distrust. It's not easy to resolve any of these difficulties, but we could think of a few things. Decentralization in a country like ours can be a blessing rather than a curse in coping with something like the crisis, the pandemic. But to do so, we have to spend a lot more attention than we ever have. It's not something you can do in the middle of the crisis, but it's something that you have to do to get ready to creating and maintaining strong intergovernmental links, especially when it comes to sharing information. Moreover, the right information needs to be collected, analyzed, and made available so that everyone in the decision chain is not only kept as fully informed as possible, but made aware of both the expected results and the actual outcomes of different policy decisions. That's pretty idealistic. At present, there are a few institutional structures, in fact, practically none in Canada, to facilitate intergovernmental communication and coordination. It's all done behind the doors, none of us quite knows, and few political incentives, and this is very clear, either to gather comprehensive information or to keep the public well informed. The advantage of the federal system, as I said earlier, is that in principle, it lets different regions tailor policies to their specific environment. You can kind of think of it as a policy laboratory where diverse experiments may lead to useful innovations that can be adopted and adapted by others. Healthcare in Canada is an example. But no one can learn much about how to deal with this or any other future crisis unless the federal government takes much more seriously than it ever has the task of coordinating with other levels of government to systematically assemble, analyze, and disseminate even interim results as rapidly and widely as possible. That's how good science works. And it doesn't matter if it's health science or policy science. Unfortunately, it's not how politics works. Finally, to return to what I think is the central theme of this conference in some ways, Canada's long used federal transfers in part to put all provinces on an equal footing with respect to providing essential public services. This is equalization. Equalization has always been criticized. It's inherent in the nature of the business. One can argue, for example, and some of these criticisms are justified, that you should take differences in needs as well as fiscal capacities into account. There are reasons why you shouldn't, but whether the size of the distributable pool, how much gets shared out, should be set as a fixed share of federal taxes or in some other way, other than what we have now. Or as the recent swings in natural resource revenues demonstrate, we really should adjust the system at least to make it a better risk-sharing instrument in times of uncertain economic change. But any of these changes would require extensive federal-provincial negotiations. And I think, in fact, what they probably require if we're ever to get a more acceptable outcome is going to be a somewhat less overtly political process of determining who gets what. I am a dreamer. Of course, there are many ways we could build back better. The budget just gave us 700 and whatever pages of how we could do this. And we're going to be talking about that, I'm quite sure. But what I want to emphasize that in a federal system is what we've got to focus on is not so much what to do, the product of what we're trying to do, but the process. How do we do it? And in particular, I'm trying to improve how governments relate to each other and the public. So I'll just leave it at that, having said nothing of substance. So there you go.
I think you actually said quite a bit of substance. Thank you very much. And I'm hoping in the questions we can get into some comparative examples as well from what you've learned around the world. But let's move on before we get to questions to our final panelist, Jim Dinning. Are you there, Jim?
I am. Can you hear me, see me?
Yes.
Thank you very much. And thank you for having me. I much enjoyed some pretty wise words from a self-confessed non-practitioner and self-confessed dreamer, Professor Bird. Thank you for that. My name is Jim Dinning. I'm an Alberta guy. I grew up here and have called her home for most of my life. 5 years at Queen's University, 2 years in Montreal at the Institute for Research on Public Policy, and then back to Queen's for a master's in public administration. I learned economics from David Dodge and David Smith. I learned political studies from George Perlin and Ed Black, and I had the honor to be mentored by John Deutsch. I was Alberta's Deputy Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs during Premier Lougheed's last 2 years in office, and then 3 times elected as an Alberta member of the legislature, Minister of Education, and then Premier Klein's Provincial Treasurer, where I got to work with Al O'Brien and Paul Booth when we cut 20% off of the bottom line spending. I was occasionally introduced those days as Canada's only living heart donor. I was very fortunate to learn from and be mentored by the likes of Deutsch and Dodge, Smith, Lougheed, O'Brien, and Booth, all of them Canadians who believed and still believe in focused and purposeful government, certainly not government overreach. Most of them from the political economy school, appropriate given our subject here today. All of them practical policy wonks who made, and thank goodness still make Canada a better place. So with that as a bit of a backdrop, I have a few comments. One, the theme of this 3-day conference is that Canadian fiscal federalism tries to strike a delicate balance among the principles of fairness, efficiency, solidarity, and provincial autonomy. Professor Trevor Thom asked for an Alberta or Western view, so I will say that in Alberta today, there is once again a growing sense of unfairness about the Federation, a withering view of its efficiency, certainly Ottawa's, a growing disunity and full agreement on one principle, the clarion call for more autonomy. Scoff as some of you might, there will be a provincial referendum on equalization when Albertans vote in Alberta's October municipal elections. The question will be, do you support the removal of Section 36, the principle of equalization, from the Constitution Act? Albertans have been told their approval would not guarantee equalization's removal from the Constitution, nor any reworking of its formula. But there is a fervent belief by many that a majority vote in favor would mandate the Premier and his government and morally obligate Ottawa and other provinces to come to the table to discuss and ultimately negotiate amendments to the Constitution. You're here to examine and debate Canadian fiscal federalism with the aim of producing a resource book for scholars, students, policymakers, and informed citizens alike. please know that this restlessness I speak of will not evaporate once your book is published. I know you might now be saying, oh, those Albertans, they just don't understand. They don't pay money into equalization. It's a federal program. Don't they know? Those rebels, once the swagger masters of Canada, finally know what it's like to be at or near the bottom. I have heard those precise words in exchanges with some of my fellow Canadians. For our swagger and excessive bravado in days past, I am sorry. We Albertans got a little carried away in the early 2000s. But if this federal state and many of its governments across the land believe we can get out of this economic and financial crater by our governments borrowing money for programs we cannot afford, that will be our federation's next blunder. Borrowing, by the way, with the strategic hope of never higher interest rates when hope is never a good strategy. And if we turn our backs on what still makes this country strong, our resourceful people and the resources of the land, if we make that mistake, the history books, I think, will be unforgiving. So please don't get me wrong. I say bring on the investments in AI and biomanufacturing and life sciences and quantum technologies and aerospace and auto. Bring it on and bring on even more. We need it all at a minimum to upsize the meager fiscal capacity of the provinces in our unbalanced federal state. And we need energy to make all that search and discovery and investment successful. Solar energy and wind and natural gas and hydrogen and hydro and tidal. We need cleaner, longer lasting lithium batteries and oil and gasoline and more clean energy technologies. More and even more. And rest assured, we need that until it's so plentiful across the planet that we have too much. Alberta will energize and lead that search and discovery and investment. They will not deter it. Notice that I said the word and 22 times. Not once did I say or as in ou. Toi et moi, pas toi ou moi. Canada has always been stronger when we live the and. We're weaker when we are or. I call it the liberation of the and the tyranny of the word or. Please don't tell Westerners that Canada's fossil-based energy is dead or dying or dirty. Not when every produced BTU meets or beats laws and standards around the environment, safety, diversity, equity, and justice. Not when there are over 1.3 billion vehicles on the planet, 99% of which need gasoline or diesel or bio blend well into the future. Not when Canada's 1.9 million new cars, new this year, gasoline or diesel reliant cars, not when they rely on Canada's energy industry to drive to work around the farm or across the country every day. Throw in the 25 million older Canadian vehicles on the road and transition for them will come, but it's not coming tomorrow. Petroleum and refined petroleum products are Canada's #1 commercial export, 2-to-1 on autos. As we dig our way out of this crater and generate the fiscal means our federation needs in order to thrive, we can't ignore what has made us strong and what 1 billion or more vehicle owners globally need from Canada. please let Canada's oil be the last barrel shipped, not the next BTU shut in or shut down. Fiscal federalism that supports the and in Canada's multi-front energy search and discovery mission will hear applause, little in the way of whining from Albertans if our political leaders embrace the and reject the or. When Trevor invited me to participate today, he had to listen to my rant about the choices we Canadians must make, of the liberation of the and the tyranny of the or. When I was done, he invited me to come anyway, and now I'm done again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dunning. Well, those are three very diverse looks at the same issue. And before I open it up to general questions, I wanted to ask the panelists themselves, do you have any question or something you want to pick up on that one of the other of you said? Yes, Mr. Lévesque, you're nodding your head. You go ahead.
Yes, absolutely. I've got two comments. I will say first that I understand many of Mr. Bird's points, but just to be clear about the pandemic, okay? To say that things are messy in Canada is one thing. Still, Canada has the lowest number of deaths per capita compared to Germany, France, Italy, the US, and the UK. Even Quebec had a bad outcome at the beginning, but everything you had up, it's still Canada. Obviously, Japan has a much lower number, Australia has a much lower number, but it's still Canada that has the lowest number of deaths and by a wide margin compared to any other country. So it's messy, but if you look at the response from the pandemic, basically the federal government took over macroeconomic support and the provinces did the delivery of care. The federal government basically went into the procurement. And yes, it would be much better if there would be more coordination. Absolutely agree with that. But on balance, it's like, let's make our comparisons. And I'm sure the OECD will have all kinds of things to say about the things we didn't do right. But at the end of the day, death numbers matter. My second point is for Jim. I would say I agree with you 95%, but the better way to say this is I love when people that are so inclined about the environment and climate change cite Norway as an example. I love it because Norway has done what our energy producing provinces have not done, which is they've used the returns from the oils from the North Sea, not as a current revenue, but as an asset, and they built up the largest sovereign wealth fund, more or less in the world, that has the stringent kind of like environmentally focused and climate focus and ethical focus in terms of investment policies, while at the same time keep on drilling. They're competing with the Russians drilling in the Barents Sea. They can think both ways, the and. That is, there's a transition, but in the meantime, the world is using and needs energy. And I think that's, to me, the example that should be given. Okay, how can you be for climate change while developing your oil? Just look at Norway.
Okay, I think we might have two panelists that might want to reply to those points. Mr. Bird, your name came up first, so would you like to reply to that comment?
Yeah, sure. I didn't want to get into the world of international comparison because it lends itself to cherry picking all the time, you know. Actually, the lowest death rate is in Bhutan, believe it or not, which also has the highest vaccination rate, much exceeding Israel. There's lots of stuff out in the world that's very strange. But anyway, in the general thing, I don't think how would I put it? I consider governments are doing very well. I think they're doing pretty good. I think we're slightly below that. I give us a sort of a good minus here, and I don't like to see my country less than good. So we should certainly do better. One of the things that does concern me is I think the communications have been terrible. I live in one of these hotspots, and I'm an old guy. So I'm all dosed up. This is not a personal problem for me, but there is, it's been exceptionally erratic. I have had endless phone calls from various sundry relatives and friends about, where can I get vaccinated and what does it really mean? And why are they asking me? I mean, this is the kind of stuff that most people should know. We don't know these things. There's an incredible amount of confusion out there. I understand there's all kinds of yahoos carrying signs and posting anti-vax videos and, that kind of stuff. But I don't see the government doing much to deal with any of this or to provide a steady hand on this. That's all I was saying there. Not that we were really messing it up, that people are saying we're messing it up, and I can see why they're saying that. And one of the reasons, I think, is because we have these very confusing things. Now, secondly, I see if I can just make a little comment on the energy stuff. One of the things, just let me point my thing out about energy that always bugs me. Coming as I do from the poor Maritimes and spent most of my life in rich Southern Ontario, I am really bothered by the lack of interprovincial coordination on energy transmission. I mean, I just don't understand why we don't having built up an energy transmission setup across the country. I really don't. It's totally baffling. I know all of the history, Quebec did this or Alberta did that or whatever. It doesn't really matter. It's just exceptionally confusing. Here we are in Ontario, going to put X $100 billion into nuclear power. The one thing that Mr. Dinning didn't mention, he is studying power sources, we're sitting there with huge amounts of electric power, hydropower being generated elsewhere and sold to the US, which may make sense. It may make sense, but we don't really seem to discuss this. It's quite odd to me, the energy thing. I've long avoided. There are people who spend their lives trying to understand all of this energy stuff, and I don't. So I do think there are some confusions there. And one last thing, I really agree with Mr. Lévesque about the kind of how Alberta blew the Heritage Fund stuff. And I would like to hear a better statement on that. I mean, I have worked with countries like, Mozambique or someplace where they think they're having oil, and then you try to set up a system so they can deal with it properly. We kind of model a lot of that on Norway, frankly. That seems to be the best example in the world. But Canada started off that way with Alberta, and it just never kind of went to anything. In fact, I don't think we've handled it as well as Alaska did, which I never thought was terribly good. But anyway, that's there. I've thrown questions at both of our other people, I hope. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Dinning, you're up.
Madeline, thank you. Louis, to get a 95% grade from you, Professor Lévesque, I'll take it. So thank you. But I would agree that Alberta's, and let's be frank, Canada's addiction to the revenues that came from fossil fuel development has gotten away on us, clearly. And I think if I had to do it over again, and fortunately when I was the treasurer, we made one attempt then to at least inflation-proof the Heritage Fund such that it had to maintain its real value. And so we started down that road. But the gush of revenue overwhelmed the government and overwhelmed expectations of Albertans that we're in the money, and we became addicted, and we're still addicted because it's still putting out revenues, including into the federal treasury, that Canada is also addicted to. And I can't do anything about yesterday. All I can do is throw in, as Professor Bird said I needed to, and we need to, is throw nuclear. And the announcement the other day amongst 4 premiers that we should be pursuing the nuclear track is just another part of the and equation I was speaking of. And I think we must do all of those things, because having a shortage of energy around the world is what will ultimately stop people moving out of poverty and into hopefully a middle income lifestyle that is calibrated against each of those countries. And I would say, I would agree with Professor Bird, our lack of an energy transmission, call it a corridor or sharing of those energy resources. That's exactly my point. The fact that we import oil today, plenty of it from the northeastern United States and from the United States, period, but also from Saudi Arabia, from Nigeria, from Russia, and Venezuela. That's something that few other countries who have the rich resources that we have, few others of them allow that to happen. They make sure that the domestic supply is the main supplier. And I do worry that political expediency, whether it's in fighting the pandemic or political expediency in dismissing or marginalizing fossil-based strength that we have in this country, political expediency has gotten in the way. And the hard, sweaty labor of the kind of coordination that Professor Bird spoke of and improved, better communication, I don't think our governments have broken the sweat that they should have in order for coordination and better communication and overcoming addiction, fiscal addictions. I don't think that they've broken the sweat that they should have.
Okay, that's an interesting point. I hope we can get back to this communication and coordination point, but I want to move here to some of the questions that have been posted. And the first one, Sebastian Hamel, I don't know if all the panelists can see it, but it's talking about local government. When we look at fiscal federalism policy in Canada, one important aspect are the needs of local governments that they face and will increasingly face. I'm just sort of trying to do a synopsis here. So how do you see the evolution of, okay, it says structurally municipalities are still trapped in the old models of funding. How do you see the evolution of how federal and provincial governments will address this? I'm sorry, Mr. Hamel, I've done a bad job of translating it, but I think your point is, you know, where do the municipalities and local governments fit in with all these visions of fiscal federalism that you're talking about? Would any of the panelists just put up your hand if you want to address this? Otherwise, I'll pick on you.
Okay, I can try.
Okay, go ahead.
I think my views, I had very strong views prior to the pandemic, and the facts may change them. Mais je vais répondre en français, puis je pense que la personne qui pose la question pour un francophone. J'ai peu de sympathie pour la situation financière des provinces, pour la simple et bonne raison que oui, pas des provinces, mais des municipalités, pour la bonne raison que oui, elles n'ont qu'une source principale de revenus, mais it's a money machine. L'impôt foncier et compte tenu du secteur immobilier est une source de revenus extrêmement, dans le fond, fiable et qui va croître très rapidement et qui va continuer de croître. Le caveat que je mettrais à mon analyse, c'est la situation des grands centres urbains. La croissance économique dans les 20 dernières années a essentiellement procédé par le service des secteurs dans les grands centres urbains. Et avec la pandémie, il n'est pas évident qu'il n'y aura pas des impacts permanents sur le modèle économique des grands centres urbains, que ce soit en termes des espaces à bureaux, mais de l'activité au centre-ville, etc., etc. Ça, je pense que c'est une variable qu'on va devoir évaluer au fur et à mesure. Le dernier point, c'est qu'il faut aussi se rappeler que beaucoup des infrastructures dont les municipalités sont responsables sont largement financées par les gouvernements provinciaux.
Okay, merci. Mr. Bird, you've got your hand up too. That's great.
Yeah, I'd said a couple of comments. You know, when I retired from teaching, I got a lot of unpaid appointments, and one of them was with the Institute for Municipal Finance and Governance. So let me just say a bit about the local government side. I think that question is a good one. in that in fact, I believe I said this, that local governments have to carry the actual pail in delivering these services in many ways, not necessarily the local municipal government, but locally based governance structures have to deal with these things. And it's and they're not really at the table when decisions are made, and they don't really kept really well informed about what's going on. So that was part of my argument. So yes, I am sympathetic to looking more seriously at the role of municipalities in governance and at the fiscal structure of municipalities. Secondly, Ms. Lévesque said that the property tax is a kind of fire hose of money like oil. It isn't. And the really big difference, there's a huge difference. If a local government raises revenue from property tax, it's within a year or two faced with an election. They are immediately politically responsible for their tax changes in a way no other government in Canada actually is. And they're very much constrained about what they do because almost the only fiscal instrument they have is the property tax. On the other, and also, as he said, kind of contradicting his earlier point, the fact that how house prices have been going up so fast is kind of counterbalanced by the fact that office space is going down in the big cities. So the property tax, over half the revenues in many cities comes from businesses. And it's not at all clear as a growing source of revenue, or that it will be in the future.
In the future.
It's possibly will. So should they have more revenue? Well, maybe not. One thing that they should have is a much more sensible system of provincial transfers. Provincial municipal transfers are something that's not well understood in most of the country. And it's not surprising because it's a complex and difficult area where there isn't clear what anybody's really trying to do. And it's not clear that whatever they're trying to do, whether they're doing it. So this is something that the Institute with which I'm connected is doing a lot of work on. And we'll be producing a number of papers on this in the near future, I think. But the answer is, yeah, I think that it's great to talk about the local level of government a little bit in a federal provincial conference, because usually you don't. And yet it's the one that actually affects the way in which people live in many ways. So I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Mr. Dinning, did you want to add anything to that?
I would only to say to Mr. Hamel, thank you for raising the question, because I'd agree that there's not much attention paid to it. And Professor Bird, I think it's quite wonderful that the instant accountability, or the speedy accountability for prudent expenditure of municipally raised dollars, I'm all for it. There should be greater accountability. And so again, I'd go back to political expedience has somehow prevented us from, I know when you talk about constitutional change, people, they start to rub their forehead and they break out. It's the very thought of a constitutional change is enough to send you over the side. But I do think that some serious effort has to be made by our national, provincial, and municipal leaders to come together in a honest and forthright way to have this very kind of conversation. And we've avoided it for all sorts of political reasons. But given the urbanization of Canada, maybe a little less so after the pandemic as people wanted to flee the cities, but that is still going to continue as that momentum will continue in after the pandemic is over. And I think that kind of a conversation is something we need in this country. And this conference could sort of begin to lay the workbook that's going to come out of this could begin to lay some ground for that conversation.
Okay. Well, that leads directly into the next question. And I think I'll just read this because I made such a hash of trying to shorten the last one. So communications, government to people, have been messy and conflicting from time to time. But what did the panelists think about intergovernmental communications during the pandemic? It seems to me, this is the questioner, that the pandemic opened up the communication channels early on, and this is perhaps a bright spot of improved federal, provincial communications moving forward. Who'd like to take that on? Well, Mr. Dinning, you're still up, so you might as well start.
You're right about the exchange amongst the public health officials of the country. I think those wires were burning up well before this became a crisis, and it hasn't stopped. But I do think the larger collateral knock-on effects of the pandemic have not led to very fruitful discussions amongst the premiers and the federal government leadership. And just even the acknowledgement around Louis' chart that showed showed the growth in healthcare expenditures. There's been lip service at best paid to that fiscal pressure. And I was on a call yesterday with Professor Booth. You'd be pleased to know, Louis, that I suggested to Paul that when he's speaking at the Johnson Shoyama School this morning, that he remind, when it comes to the discussion of 50-50 commitment on childcare funding, that he go back to the great promises of 1966, when Her Majesty's government promised that they would go 50-50 on cost sharing with respect to medical care outside of hospitals. And within 10 years, that commitment had evaporated, and it's only deteriorated ever since. So be careful what provinces ask for when Ottawa comes promising 50-cent dollars.
Okay, that's a good warning. Would either of the other panelists want to weigh in on this question?
Sure. I'll put a more general point about the communications. I think the pandemic has shown us the impacts of really profound trends affecting society, notably the much reduced deference to experts, the profound impact on social media on propagating, I would say, not exactly true information. And I think I would go back to Jim's comments about the importance of having a reasonable debate on issues like energy for Canada. Just to put that in context on this one, when I was at Trade, we calculated that basically Canada, at the time, that was in around 2010, was losing, pure and simple, $20 billion a year in price differentials between the price we're paying on the oil we're buying and the price we're paying on the oil we're selling. Yeah. One kind of way to basically say that is like over the last 15 years, we have collectively burned destroyed $200 billion of wealth because of that. And we cannot have, to me, a sensible debate along the lines of we both need to address climate change, but we also are in a transition. A transition is not a cliff. That is, it's going to go down gradually. And in the meantime, our largest export earning item is $100 billion of Canadian oil. Where do you see? And part of it is what's happened to the traditional media. Like we don't have the Walter Cronkites, like basically the impact of the evening news on bringing people back to the center on a somewhat of coherent fact-based perspective on reality. We have two bubbles at the extremes that are feeding off themselves to the algorithms of social media. And we're not having those conversations. We are burning, quote unquote, $20 billion a year of wealth. We could do a lot of good things on inclusion, diversity, whatever. And the fact we're not selling our oil is not going to make the planet any better because somebody else is going to sell it. But for some reason, we can't appear to be able to have a, quote, an evidence-based discourse about these things.
Okay, well, that actually leads me to a question that I wanted to ask Professor Bird. Because you stressed this whole idea of, in fact, all the panelists have stressed the idea of we need better communication and coordination. And I know, Professor Bird, you said you didn't want to get into international comparisons, but I'm going to ask you,
Sure.
Is there another federation out there that you think presents some sort of a model for Canada, or some initiatives out there where they do a better job on communicating and coordinating between the different levels of government? What have you seen that might offer us a bit of hope here?
Well, I'm one of those academics who, when he finishes a book, thinks that's the end of the discussion. And if nobody reads it, that's their problem, not mine. But anyway, in the, I've written 3 books on this issue. I don't think I could pick it all up. But let's just say, well, you know, I lived in Australia, for example, for a couple of years. And that's a very strange place for a Canadian. I also lived in the US for 10 years. So I've lived in 2 other federations and 3 other unitary countries, but every country is really completely different. I mean, Australia shows you it's kind of neat to be an island in many ways. I mean, you know, borders are not a huge problem. It shows you also that they have their local governments are, I mean, our local governments are giants that walk the earth compared to Australian local governments, which are nothing. I mean, the states run everything. And it's a completely different kind of system. Also, it's a far more homogeneous area in many ways. But the one thing that it has is a very different approach to resources. They have the mining is one thing that's mostly in a particular area, and there's a lot of problems there. But the oil stuff is offshore. So their treatment of the oil and gas, insofar as they have it, is basically kind of like what we did in the Atlantic region, and neither of us did what Norway did, but you know, we kind of in the same road. What they've done with the onshore stuff, which, you know, this is interesting in Australia because not everybody knows this, but they have some of the worst coal in the world. They're also probably now the world's largest coal exporter. My daughter lived in Newcastle, which was the biggest coal export port I ever saw in my life. There were like 29 ships lined up loaded with coal every day going to China. It's a completely different setup, but they have done nothing with regard to this. They also have this terrible lignite, this kind of brown coal, which is even worse in many ways. They make use of all this stuff. Now, on the other hand, they also have some other positive features. I must say, my ideal federation is actually Switzerland. I lived there for only a short period of time, but I have never, the extent to which a Swiss, as the Swiss like to say, they're only Swiss when they're outside of Switzerland. When they're in Switzerland, they're, you know, not just the department, the state in which they live, but also the commune, the village in which they live. I've never seen an extent to which a community system has been extended to a country. It's a small country. But I also lived in the Netherlands, which is another small country, but highly centralized, but very different, and it's becoming less centralized as time goes on. So there is a wide variety of experiences. We all have to do our own thing. And I don't think we've done a bad job. I rather think I hold this up as an example to the Americans in many ways about how to do things. Not that they ever listen, but it's a good thing. So I'm not knocking Canada. I think we learn a lot by looking at other things. I remember going back to Queen's, Ron Watts held a conference once on this comparative federalism, and I talked about the fiscal stuff. And he later said to me that he didn't know how I could say all these strange things about these strange countries. And I said to him, look, your constitution for Papua New Guinea was completely wrong, because I also lived there. But it's, you know, we all are experts in different things. We do stuff. I have no answers to anything, really. I just have an awful lot of questions and some suggestions about how to go about finding them out. And one of them is exactly what Louis was talking about. I mean, this evidence-based stuff, any of us who've worked with and for governments as experts, quotes always on the experts, we spend most of our time not providing the evidence on which people make decisions, but trying to persuade people that the decisions they want to make conflict with the evidence that we seem to have. And sometimes you persuade people and sometimes you don't. And then they will always ask you the following, what's the right answer? And, most of us in economists, we kind of do these estimates and stuff. I don't do that anymore, but we used to do a lot of it. You always give them the middle. I mean, it's some answers somewhere in here. We have a range. They don't want to hear that. They want the number. And so you end up giving them a number. And half the time your job as a policy advisor is just to try to get them, they want to do something that's not very sensible. You try to think of the least harmful way it can be done. And anybody who's worked in the federal government or for the federal government is well aware of this process. Experts don't make the decisions. What they try to do is present the evidence, and we all do it the same way. One extreme, the other extreme, in the middle. The middle's the secret. So you want them all to go for the middle, but they are used to this trick. So you'd have to then present in a different way. It's all a game, but it's not a game. It's people's lives. And I really don't know the whole work of the policy scientists that have been fooling around with for decades is just trying to understand better how policy is actually formulated and made and delivered and how we can possibly improve it. How to speak truth to power in such a way that power can understand it and implement it in a way that actually affects outcomes. That's a tough game to play. I'm not very good at it. That's why I'm retired. So.
Okay, thank you. I'm wondering about either of the other two panelists. Have you seen any structures out there in intergovernmental communications? This is what I'm talking about, the Canada, because all of you are saying we need better communications between the different levels of government. Have you seen anywhere else that it actually works? Or even something in Canada at a different level that might be applied so we could get together and talk about these things and have the discussion that you're calling for?
Just from practical experience, I think the frame of the question is way too negative. There are many intergovernmental forums that are sector-based that work very well. The people in the public health, whether in transport, whether it's in agriculture, they work together all the time, okay? And we largely share a body of evidence that's largely shared because they're experts, they know the sectors and everything like that. I think there's an expectation there would be some kind of table of discussions, of editorial discussions. I'm not sure that actually works. I was Deputy Minister of Intergovernmental Relations. I always thought that the discussions at the sectoral tables were much more practical and effective in terms of, and so that's my impression. Now, back to a point that was made about how you make public policy. I've been somewhat involved in that for the years. A couple of points. You're right, Richard, that very often it's about saying to people that doesn't make sense, but in a way that does not undo trust. Because fundamentally, if I want to be a deputy minister and I want a minister to listen to me, I have to understand where the person is coming from. And that means understanding the communications environment that they're living in, because it's not so much that they disagree with what I want to say, what I'm saying very often, it is, how do I explain that to the public? And we go back to the basic point about, quote, an informed public being a condition of effective democracy. Because at some point, if you have 50% of the population that believes that the President of the United States was not legally elected, well, there's absolutely zero evidence of any fraud at any material level. This is a hard fact to manage. And if you've got these two polarized kind of extremes that are fighting one another and you try to be in the center, that is a very difficult thing. The final point I would make, I love baseball. So what's the point? As a deputy minister, one thing you have to accept is very often decisions are going to be made against your advice. Frankly, if you can't live with that, get another job. And in terms of, and the baseball analogy is good batters bat for 300. I mean, 7 out of time, they are kind of, they're struck out or whatever. So,
yeah.
Mr. Dinning, did you want to weigh in on this?
Well, I guess I'm going back into ancient history, Madeline, but when the government was elected in 1992, 93 in Alberta, then Premier Ralph Klein was his first election. We actually believed inside the government that we had a serious problem. But as we polled Albertans, they didn't think the fiscal problem was much of a problem. So we realized that we knew it was a problem. So you know what we did? We actually went out and sold Albertans on the problem of our fiscal mess. And you know, we polled it and found when we started that about 25% of Albertans believed that it was a problem. By the time we were done, we cranked it up to 48% believed that we had a fiscal problem in the province. And we considered that victory and in many ways permission to get on with the job. And I think that politicians today tend to, you know, the word salad that comes out of off politicians' lips, the meaningless, anesthetizing banalities that our media seems too often to just lap up. And there is, you know, we talked about Walter Cronkite. We don't have somebody, an eminence grise in the media saying, you know, that's just bullshit. What you just said just doesn't make sense. Tell us the facts. And I do think that kind of, you know, other than the pandemic and the modeling that shows calamity, which didn't happen. So therefore, I go back to Richard's comment about citizen trust and fairness. There's what's missing, and notwithstanding Louis' concern that we were framing this too negatively, I do think that the trust barometer, and maybe Edelman, I haven't read an Edelman study lately, you probably have, Madeline, but I do worry that the trust barometer of our politicians and political leadership is not there. And I throw in one more piece that, you know, Trevor reminded me that our objective here is to help with the creation of this resource book. I would go one step further, and I hope the resource book becomes the makings of an agenda of items, structures, practices that governments need to consider at all 3 levels of government as we get ready for building, whether it's Build Back Better, which I still don't know. You know, again, that's an anesthetizing banality that still escapes me. But I do think that these political economists gathered here in the next 3 days could begin to identify the makings of an agenda.
Okay. This is not the place to turn this into a discussion about what's going on in the media, but I do have to say, because several of you have brought it up, there is a disaster happening in the traditional media industry in Canada, and the newspapers, the TV stations, all of those things that we've grown used to growing up, you know, sort of delivering a message to a wide number of people, that doesn't really exist anymore. And whatever recommendations come out of this about spreading the word and communication has to take that into account, that today's media is nothing like it was even 10 years ago or 20 years ago. But that's just my little pitch about the disaster in the media. I did want to ask another question that has come in to all the panelists, which is, and it's not on your Q&A, I got it separately, but What do you think the federal government's contribution should be to healthcare financing? This sort of brings us full circle back to where we started, but have you got a particular idea in mind of what the contribution should be? And maybe Mr. Lévesque, I'll start with you.
The simple answer to that that I have at this point, I don't have. I think I would say more broadly, what should the federal government do to help provinces with fiscal sustainability? Rule number one, do no harm. First thing is restoring the fiscal situation of the federal government, but without like making cuts to transfers to provinces or making the situation worse. And obviously growing the economy is very important. As to the exact amount, I don't think there's an exact answer, but certainly it's, I don't think it's defendable for federal support not to grow in line with provincial spending. For a while, it was growing at 6%, which was kind of faster than provincial spending. But now it's not likely to be growing at the same rate as provincial spending. So I'd say at the minimum, it should go at provincial spending. The other thing I would think about is what can the federal government do to help with changes in the healthcare system to both improve outcomes and in terms of improve productivity? Now, when we talk about productivity in healthcare, like everybody, just if you were to do a study of the time, the typical nurse, how the time on the job of a typical nurse is spent, you would see massive opportunities for either technology, better organization, to ensure that they are basically doing what they're trained to do and have maximum impacts. So in this case, I would say the federal government could basically decide to fund things, initiatives. They don't have to be transfer type. It could be like through a trust fund or with a third party to basically projects to improve delivery. And then it gets into comparison of outcomes, coordination. And I think over time, like, you're not going to see results over like 2 years or whatever, but that's the way to do it, how to curb the growth in costs. It cannot be just simply adding money. It has also to be how do you ensure that you're using the resources you apply to healthcare the best way possible. And I would not certainly have this run in a federal department basically saying to provinces you should be doing this or that. No.
Good.
In terms of
Good.
no.
Okay, Mr. Dinning, sounds like you want to weigh in
Oh,
there.
no, Louis, you're absolutely right. It is, I think even Louis would agree that the federal government's track record and capacity to deliver programs is limited. That's why we have provinces and that's why we have cities. So I would say the one thing that the federal government could do is call it what you want. Call it turn a blind eye, or nudge, cajole, incent provinces to be more experimental in the delivery of healthcare services. For God's sakes, in this day and age, it makes no sense that every hospital needs to be built, or every operating theater needs to be built with public dollars. It's nonsense. I had the good fortune to be, after I'd left government, I don't know why I said yes, but I agreed to be the chair of the Calgary Regional Health Authority. It became the Calgary Health Region because we realized we had so little authority. And what we did is we had a 6-month waiting list on MRIs. We thought, this is just this is not care or quality care. So we said, who can do us MRIs faster and frankly cheaper than we can do them? And we put out an RFP. We got 4,000 scans done at a much reduced price, and we cleared up the backlog so that it was gone within down to 30 days. And that was a private sector provider using public funds to take that pressure out of the healthcare system. And I think that provinces have been less than courageous when it comes to experimenting with private sector delivered, publicly funded services. That's number one. Number two, and I'll go out on a limb here and say that I do think that this age-old embracing of only a publicly funded system is frankly a bit of a joke because of the amount of leakage that a number of people access, can afford to access, do access, not only in Canada, but beyond our borders. And acknowledge that that's something that happens, frankly, around the world. And let's not discourage or do everything we can to stop it.
Okay, thank you. So from you, more experimentation from Mr. Lévesque, you know, at least keep the funds up to what the provinces are spending. Mr. Bird, would you like to weigh in here?
Yeah, the two previous speakers, both good ideas, but they contradict each other. The trouble is that, Louis, that was the way we originally set the health finance up, basically. That it would expand however the provinces spent it. It turned out, you know, they just spent it. You give people a lot of 50-cent dollars from their point of view, and they spend a lot of them. That was why they started all the changes with the transfer system back in the 90s. And I think one of the ways of, I think that's still a problem. And I think if we said to the federal government, you know, just open the doors of the Treasury and give the provinces as much money for health as they decide to spend. I mean, come on, you're not going to do that. Nobody's going to do that, right? So if it's tied to this other idea about the changing productivity in the health system. A long time ago, when I was the director of the Institute for Policy Analysis in the University of Toronto, I tried to start a study on analyzing the productivity of service industries, education, health, and so on. Well, it's hard things to do. But health is much more easy to study, actually, than education is. And it turns out there are, as you both have indicated, there are all kinds of ways you can, in fact, improve health services. Now, one of the things you see, if you want to do these international comparisons, is that Canada is incredibly focused on this public health stuff. I mean, most countries, decent countries that you work in say Northern Europe, they all have fine public health systems, right? Marching along with and hand in hand with and interchanging with fine private systems. They're perfect. I mean, as I say, I lived in the Netherlands. They're both there and you use them both. It's not a problem. It all works very well, but we can't even talk about it here. We just had a Supreme Court case yet again on this kind of issue. I think that's ridiculous. I do think we could do a lot of improvement there. When you get into it, I have a daughter who's a nurse in British Columbia. No, actually in Alberta. And she's told me that her life as a nurse has been changed from one where you actually dealt with patients to one where you deal only with paper. I mean, she says it's not really computers, it's still paper. And a large part of it is governments trying to get ever more control over the health spending when they don't know what they're doing. And the people at the front line end up having to give them all this kinds of information rather than actually provide services. There really is a problem there. Most nurses it's not the workload with the patients they're complaining about, it's all that other stuff.
Yeah, we still have fax machines with curly paper.
Oh, we do too. Whole medical system in Ontario is based on faxes. I don't even know. I've forgotten what a fax is, but it's so there's certainly a lot you could do, but there are all kinds of problems in this sector. And one of them is that we've tried to change with the health. I loved your story about Calgary Regional Health Authority. We have a lot of those kind of things also. But the problem is that they don't have much authority, and what they do, they mostly try to exercise by imposing yet more rules on the people who are actually down there trying to do stuff. This is ridiculous. Easy to talk about, very hard to change. We're blocked by, in part, by a lot of rules in the professions. The way we control professions in Canada makes a lot of problems here. But it's going to be very hard to do all of this. Yeah, we should be focusing on this. We should be doing more about it. One last thing, I do think we have actually been communicating across governments much better in the health crisis than ever before. what a shame we haven't reached that level when it comes to, like, you know, where we're going to put the new water plant or where the highway is going to run. If you work with local governments, they're overrun by provincial decisions on these things. There really is very little interchange. Lots in the sectoral sector, but it doesn't get up to the political level.
Right.
And that's the problem. So,
two clarifications on my side. First, I never advocated to go back to cost sharing. I think if you can track aggregate provincial spending, there's zero incentive problems. Every province still facing the same budget constraint. And the other point is, both of you mentioned private in terms. I think the point that Jim made is crucial. Private delivery of publicly financed services. On publicly financed, personally, I take no prisoners. We are already one of the countries in the OECD with the highest level of private funding in terms in health. And there's ample evidence to the fact that private funding doesn't help at all with overall cost, outcomes, and obviously equity. But private delivery, absolutely.
Okay, I'm really sorry to cut it off right now. We're just sort of catching fire, but we've come to the end of our time. I just wanted to say there were two other questions out there. I think the last one has been answered. I hope so. There was one to the conference organizers, which I will make sure to pass along. And I just want to thank our three panelists for taking the time today to have this discussion. It was really interesting. We covered a lot of ground. We'll see what shows up in the workbook at the end of this that's supposed to come up. But thank you, Louis Lévesque, Jim Dinning, Richard Bird. It was very good of you to spend some time with us today. And that concludes this particular session, but the conference continues tomorrow. And I hope that everyone will tune back in, because I'm sure the other sessions will be as interesting. Thank you very much.